Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom Series. I'm Brian Whittemore, your host for today. As you may know, Itasca Waters is a nonprofit whose goal is to educate residents in Itasca County about how to keep our water clean for both the environment and the economy. We've been teaming up with like-minded people and organizations for nearly 15 years now, and you can read about those projects on our website, itascawaters.org. If any of that is of interest to you, please consider becoming a member or a volunteer to help support programs like this. And we thank our partners shown on your screen for their support in producing this program. The format for today's program will be this. Dr. John Downing will speak for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll answer questions from you. To submit a question, you only need to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in a brief question. And you can do this at any time. We will read the questions on your behalf, and we will not be using the chat function today. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing online through our website, itascawaters.org. Finally, we value your opinion, so please click on the survey link, which will be on screen at the end of today's program, or complete the survey that will be sent to you by email. So we thank you for doing that. Now, today's presenter is Dr. John Downing, longtime member of Itasca Waters. He is director of the Sea Grant College program, a research scientist at the Large Lakes Observatory on Lake Superior, and a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. He holds a BS in biology from Hamline University, an MS in zoology from North Dakota State University, and a PhD in biology from McGill University. John was previously Regents Excellence Professor of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology, and Chair of the Environmental Science Graduate Program at Iowa State University. He was a professor at McGill University and the University of Montreal, where he was director of the Laurentian Biological Station. He is the former president of the Association for the Sciences of Limnology and Oceanography. His areas of expertise range from aquatic ecology and fisheries biology to whole ecosystem management, resource economics, and global carbon cycling. He has received several international awards for scientific research on lakes. His family has lived on Wabana Lake in Itasca County since 1904, and his lifelong interest in lakes was born there. Dr. Downing's topic today is supernatural lakes, monsters, ghosts, witches, fairies, and aliens. For centuries, people have looked at lakes and ponds as places of mystery, wonder, and the unknown. Perhaps this is because they can't easily see beneath the surface, so they let their imaginations run wild. Or is it really a mystery? As a Halloween treat, John will talk about supernatural lakes and tell stories of lake monsters, lake ghosts, lake witches, wicked water fairies, and even aliens harbored beneath the seemingly serene waters of lakes around the world. Kick your Halloween off the aquatic way and learn some strange and supernatural things about the lakes we love. With all that being said, we got a superstar in our hands today, Dr. Downing. We're ready to take the plunge.
Thanks, Brian. It's such an honor to be introduced by such a seasoned broadcaster, and an honor also to be invited by Itasca Waters to talk about this topic, which I hope you'll have some fun with. So I'm going to talk about even more things than Brian said. We got to talk about mummies too, and we'll get to that in just a second. And I just hope that you learn some stuff about lakes, some surprising stuff about lakes today, and also learn that lake science can be particularly fun too, and that not all scientists are so boring. After listening to the introduction, that a wonderful introduction that Brian gave, I'd be now thinking, well, this guy's going to be boring. I hope I'm not. There down to the lower left on your screen, you'll see me as a zombie. I think my daughter Anna made the first zombie picture of me. This is one I made on makemeazombie.com, which you may want to use for your Halloween pleasure. So As Brian suggested, when people look down into lakes, they think of them as a bit of a mystery and they wonder about what's going on down there. You look into a forest, you can see through it. So you can see the things that are there. You look at a lake, you see the surface, you see a little way down, but there are lots of things going on down there that people may wonder about. And we'll talk about a bunch of those today, I hope. You may ask, how did scientists get interested in this kind of spooky stuff? And part of it, and I'll try to explain real briefly, but part of it is that I'm really interested in carbon cycling globally. And lakes are really important in carbon cycling. And really importantly, they bury a lot of sediments. Anybody who's ever tossed an anchor into a lake will know that there's a lot of carbon down there, a lot of sediment, and those sediments can be preserved for really long periods of time. And I call this part of lakes the fact that they are organic carbon sinks, and that coarse particulate organic carbon is going down there and being stored. Now, I got interested in this because I wanted to figure out how come that coarse particulate organic carbon was being kept there for long periods. And there are lots of reasons that sediments build up in lakes. Organic matter, which I call coarse particulate carbon, is extremely well preserved, even for millennia in lakes. And sometimes coarse particulate carbon was really big, was previously sentient, had hopes and dreams, and refuses to die and decompose. And that's kind of how I got into this, thinking about the preservation of big particles in lakes and by a couple of different mechanisms. And lakes preserve even extremely large particulate carbon. And I want to talk about two stories really quickly about mummification or preservation or undead in lakes. And I'll talk about drowned deans, which, since I'm an academic, is, well, close to my heart, and hanged danes. And both of these are examples of coarse particulate carbon burial. So if you look through the New York Times and look in various places, you'll find many cases of perfect preservation of bodies in lakes. And the one that got me hooked on this was finding that the Dean Douglas of New Jersey College for Women had disappeared on Lake Placid in 1933. And her perfectly preserved body was found at the bottom of Lake Placid 30 years later. It was so remarkably preserved that they called the police because they felt there had been a recent murder. This Dean, Mabel Douglas, was in fact found down there by a couple of divers who were doing an open water test, and the Dean was lost in the lake in about 100 feet and was recovered after 30 years without any particular decomposition. And oddly, the death was ruled accidental, despite the fact that there was a 50-pound anchor around her neck. So Dean Douglas was what we call saponified, and there's a lot of saponification that goes on, not just of deans, but of different kinds of organisms that fall into lakes and go to the bottom. Just to gross you out a little, here are some pictures of lake saponification or mummies that are created by saponification. And there are lots of lakes that have these. Lake Tahoe is rumored to be filled with hundreds of bodies suspended in deep water. There's a well-preserved body of a scuba diver that was discovered after 17 years and looked like a recent death. And just anything that goes into these lakes tends to stay there for a long time and in really good shape. A journalist friend of mine said, sounds like you're giving a tip of the day. The tip of the day is lakes are not very good for getting rid of bodies. Just remember that in case it comes in any practical use to you. Well, what is saponification? Well, basically, saponification is turning our fatty tissue into soap, and it's done in lakes that are just a little bit alkaline, just a little bit more basic than a neutral pH. There have to be particular bacteria around that are pretty common in lakes. It has to be a little bit low oxygen and low alkalinity, like headwater lakes. And basically on the screen, what we're doing is taking our tissue that is kind of cloudy looking like butter and through hydrolysis, turning it into clear fats. And then those clear fats, by hydrogenation, are turned into soapy tissue, hard soapy tissue that, in fact, will be preserved for very long periods of time. There are lots of other cases where lakes and bogs preserve bodies. This is a Danish guy who was tossed into a bog 2,500 years ago. This is called Tollen Man. And the brown water in small lakes can tan bodies just like leather, or mummify them, really, very similar to what happened in Egypt on purpose. Tossing into lakes has been a common way to dispose of corpses for a long time. This particular unfortunate guy was hanged, apparently, and then tossed into a bog, and the body was found 2,500 years ago, virtually perfectly preserved, including clothing, including the content of his gut, and so on. There also are accidental preservations, and some of those stories are pretty sad. We have a lot of those kinds of bogs and bog-like lakes. This humic acid will inactivate the bacteria and the enzymes in bacteria and slow down decomposition. Then there's a reaction called the Maillard reaction that basically sucks the water out of tissue and dries it out, and then the collagen fibers cross-link, making them resistant to decomposition, altering the color of the tissue into a brown color. There are lots of other cases of extreme rates of limnological carbon conservation. Some of you may have found saw logs in lakes. A lot of these are on the bottom of the harbor in Lake Superior down here. Wood is very well preserved. Archaeologists also know that paleo peoples used to use lakes for preserving meat. They didn't have refrigeration and probably didn't have much in the way of salting. So you'd cut up things like a mastodon and put it down in the water and bring it back up months later. It was, in fact, relatively safe to eat, although tasting sour. The same has been done by Neanderthals for way back in history. Well, here's another story of horror. A lake didn't preserve this human monster who was Caligula, but preserved his deadly party boats. Caligula, who I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with, was a pretty evil guy, and he built these big party boats and kept them on a lake. And sometimes the guests were murdered kind of as part of the entertainment. I don't find that very entertaining, but he was such an evil guy, he had two or more of these great big ships done that were sunk by his friends when they murdered him. There were 30 of them. 30 of his best friends murdered him. This is the death of 1,000 cuts. Boats were really big. They were sunk in AD 41 and recovered in 1932, virtually unchanged. The monstrous party boats simply refused to decay. Well, lakes are really famous also for harboring ghosts and witches. They're very common and thought to kill the living. A couple lakes in Minnesota that apparently have ghosts in them, or have been reported to have ghosts, would be Fountain Lake near Delano and Monaga Lake near Monaga. And Lake Superior also has been reported to have a lot of ghosts attached to the coastal zone. Lake Champlain out in New York State also has a vengeful witch that will sink your boat. Apparently, hundreds of other lakes are thought to be haunted by ghosts. And these ghosts are often murderous. And this I don't fully understand, but then I don't have much understanding of ghosts. Perhaps it's due to vengeance. Perhaps they're lonely and want company. The Great Lakes have tons of ghosts, including ghost ships. And you can see one of those, a photograph of one of those ghost ships in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, I hope. The Lady in White of Stowe Lake and Golden Gate Park is very famous and has appeared, or have been reported to appear to many, many people. Well, you're not alone if you think you've seen a ghost. 18% of Americans say they have seen a ghost. 29% say that they're in touch with the dead. And according to some surveys out of UC Berkeley, over 1/3 of Americans say that they believe in the spirits of the dead coming back. 40% say they feel they've been in the presence of someone who has died. And a Gallup poll indicates that 75% of Americans believe in the paranormal. So if you have some feeling that you've seen ghosts around lakes or anywhere else, you're not alone. Here are some of the most haunted lakes in the United States, and I'll get to some of the Minnesota lakes in just a second, or at least the rumors of their haunting. Lake Lanier in Georgia has a ghost of a long dead woman that roams in a flowing blue dress. Haunted Lake, New Hampshire is often heard to have groaning and shrieks as of human beings in distress. White Rock Lake in Texas has a beautiful drowning victim in a white dress, appears to people for asking for help. Veterans Lake in Oklahoma has two ghosts that lure people into the water to drown. And Lake Superior has a freighter called Kamloops that sank with all hands. 50 years later, a preserved crew member followed divers around the engine room. And there's so many more. If you just look at the names of Minnesota lakes, you'll get the sense that many people think that lakes are haunted. Minnesota has a ghost lake, a haunted lake, 2 skeleton lakes, 3 grave lakes, a mummy pond, 2 phantom lakes, 2 spirit lakes, a superstition lake, 2 screamer lakes, and 2 skull lakes, among many others of these haunted, or apparently haunted water bodies. Next, I'd like to turn to something that is even more sort of mysterious and odd, and in which we've had a hand in, probably destroying. These would be murderous water fairies, or you may know of these apparitions as will-o'-the-wisp. These are legendary. These have been legendary dangers of water bodies since before the Renaissance. These are floating sentient flames beckoning travelers at night across water and into a watery death. In Latin, these are called ignis fatuus, or silly flame. English terms are will-o'-the-wisp, jack-o'-lanterns. There's the original jack-o'-lantern, ghost candles. In Mexico, they're called brujas. In Brazil, boitata. Argentina, Uruguay, they're called luz mala. And Colombia, la candeleja. Have been found across the world, and they are they've been a whole lot less visible recently, and I'll get around to that in a second. But travelers in the old days would follow those lights, thinking it was a house, and then stumble into water and drown. These are largely thought to be fairies, witches, and wandering souls, lost souls, or ghosts. Well, why do these things happen? I mean, other than fairies, being fairies or witches or ghosts. A will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon, or ignis fatuus, is due to the oxidation of phosphine and diphosphane, a couple of chemicals. You knew there had to be a little chemistry in this talk, right? And then they attack methane and create floating flames. These are produced by organic decay, and this causes photon emissions. Phosphine and diphosphane mixtures spontaneously ignite on contact with air, causing floating flames, and small quantities ignite methane to create ephemeral fires until the methane runs out. So apparently we've killed most of the murderous fairies, because news reports of will-o'-the-wisp peaked about 1950 and have declined ever since. You can see one of the New York Times articles about will-o'-the-wisp, a common phenomenon. And I've tried to figure out why these things may have disappeared. And I think probably the disappearance is best related to acidification. You need phosphine to make this happen, and that happens maximally at around a pH of 8 or 10. And if you drive through atmospheric acidification, drive that pH downward, phosphine won't be produced. We've also warmed lakes and waters, and the highest phosphine production happens at about 20 to 30 degrees C, and at warmer temperatures, it decreases very fast, and also sediments tend to limit phosphine production, thus taking away the murderous fairies. The increased climate change is an unintended consequence of killing fairies and ghosts. Here you see a couple of people lighting off the methane coming out of a pond on ice. A terrific amount of methane goes off into the atmosphere from lakes and is damaging to the atmosphere, exacerbating climate change. But if we have in fact decreased ignis fatuus, it used to convert methane to CO2. Methane is a much nastier greenhouse gas than CO2, about 34 times. And so the lack of oxidation by the will-o'-the-wisp means that increased atmospheric impact and more exacerbation of climate change. Well, I can't give a talk about spooky and scary stuff about lakes without someone asking about monsters. So we're going to talk about monsters. We'll talk about monsters in general, and lake monsters in general, and lake monsters in Minnesota and around the United States and the world. This is the most famous lake monster. This is the Loch Ness monster, and I'd be surprised if you haven't heard about the Loch Ness monster. It is a classical mare horse, and I'll show you the different kinds of lake monsters that have been reported in just a minute. If you go to the U.S., here's a photograph of Champ, who is probably the best known U.S. lake monster in Lake Champlain. This is a photo that's been analyzed to try to prove that it was fake. It doesn't seem to be fake. And you can see on the lower left a list of many, many sightings of the Champlain lake monster. So probably the most classical lake monster and the most frequently cited in the United States. It is what's called a water horse, or looks like it has a horse-like head and fits into that sort of typology. Well, there are lots of lake monsters that have been reported, and those numbers on that map show where lake monsters had been reported by about 2006. And apparently at that time, there were 95 reported in Canada, 158 in the United States. And Wisconsin holds the record for the largest number of lake monsters per square mile of any state or province in North America. There are thousands of more lake monsters that have been reported. It's not just about Loch Ness or Champ. They seem to show up everywhere. You may ask, do we have lake monsters in Minnesota? Well, apparently so. Lake Pepin has a very famous lake monster that was first reported in 1871 called Pepe. Lake Minnetonka has Mikinak that hasn't been reported a lot recently, but has been studied or sought out. Leech Lake has a monster, but anytime I search for information, I say monster Leech Lake, and all I get is muskies. So I don't know a lot about that one. Basswood Lake apparently has a monster that spouts like a whale. Big Pine Lake has its monster called Oscar, and of course Lake Superior has Pressy. And that's the artist's rendition there on the right of what Pressy is supposed to look like. So we've got them. Worldwide, however, there are lots of types of reported lake monsters, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. The classic is a sea serpent that is up to 90 feet long. There is also the water horse or mare horse, like Loch Ness or like Champ. There are mystery cetaceans that would look something like Zeuglodon, an extinct kind of whale. And these are up to 60 feet in length, or reported 60 feet in length. Sharks exist in fresh waters in some places in the world, and up to 80-foot long sharks have been reported. in lakes. Mystery rays up to 14 feet in length. Great water centipedes, 50 feet long. I find this is pushing credibility. Mystery saurians, like, crocodiles, plesiosaurians, and so on, up to 60 feet in length. Cryptid chelonians or turtles, up to 30 feet long. Mystery sirenians, this would be sea cows or manatees, up to 25 feet in length in lakes. Giant beavers, 14 feet long, and that is a big beaver. Mystery monitors that are lizard-like things up to 15 feet long have been postulated, and even mystery salamanders, 15 feet in length, which makes those that we find seem kind of tiny. There's some less mysterious potential explanations for monsters that have been spotted. Lines of otters can look kind of like a monster. A moose or a line of mooses swimming could look a bit like one of the mare horses. And then there's some outsized fish that things like sturgeon and extremely large catfish that could be mistaken for lake monsters. I wanted to answer the question, though, are lake monsters ecologically plausible? Well, the body sizes aren't without precedent in aquatic systems. They range from about 200 pounds to 10,000 pounds, like basically from the size of a striped dolphin to the size of a sperm whale. Their lifespan, following ecological principles, should be 22 to 92 years with an average of 55. Population density, though, this should give you some peace that if there are monsters, they have to be herbivores. Otherwise, there would be only less than about a third of a monster per lake. Herbivores could have up to 1,000 monsters per lake with an average of about 118 monsters. Could they sustain a population? Probably not, because normally to sustain populations of almost anything, it would take about 3,900 monsters in a lake, and we rarely see very many at a time. So a sustained population of lake monsters is really only possible if monsters were tiny, and who cares about tiny monsters, I'd suggest. So here's some generalizations about monsters, because people really like them. That's a fake monster in Lake George, by the way, in that image, Lake George, New York. They're mostly seen in large lakes, larger than 20 square miles. They're big. A small one would be 600 pounds. They are shy and don't surface very frequently. People think they're carnivorous, strong, sneaky, and dangerous, but I don't think that they can exist. They're probably herbivorous. Some are ecologically and limnologically plausible, and we may have driven several to extinction since the 1960s because sightings have decreased. The bottom line is you're really pretty safe from lake monsters in our lakes, unless you're on a very big lake that has small monsters, or you smell like or look like a salad, or some kind of other kind of vegetation. Pretty safe from monsters. So about this time of year, as people take out their docks and boat lifts and things like that, I get reports often of alien life that lives in lakes. And at the lower right there, you see usually the culprit, and that is a very large water brain or colony of bryozoans. They look disgusting, and they look like alien life. You almost can't imagine. They're all very jelly-like, and they can be very big, as large. This is a smallish one. They can be as big as basketballs or even larger than that. So people are pretty sure that alien life must show up in lakes. Well, Hollywood is also very sure that extraterrestrials, aliens, and UAPs love lakes too. And here's a list of some of the lakes that portray lakes as the sites for alien landings and sightings. I think things like, I don't know if you can read it, but there's Groom Lake, Landing Lake, The Man Who Fell to Earth, the Falcon Lake Incident, which is actually a documentary, Alien Encounter at Loch Ness, At First Light, UFO Target Earth, and The Recall. And there are lots more of them, I'm sure. I don't watch that many films, but those are some that I have run into. So are there reports of extraterrestrial life in lakes? And um, actually, Elizabeth Lake, California, has been thought since ancient times to harbor metallic flying craft. The Falcon Lake incident in Manitoba is probably the most well-documented incident of alien spacecraft showing up in and around lakes. Reportedly, Colbún Lake in Chile was nearly drained by a UFO that sucked up 1 billion gallons of water. And the disappearance of the water is documented, but the UFO not. There are long-standing legends of Lake Baikal in Siberia inhabited by aliens. In fact, by multiple species of aliens, maybe a little bit like that big office in Men in Black. UAP sighting at Hillsdale, Michigan was actually mistaken at first for the will of the wisp and then revised to be actually a UFO sighting. Pascagoula River alien abduction was in Mississippi. And recently, since some of the lakes in the world are drying, Dongting Lake in China has been thought to have alien construction. There you see what is purported to be construction by extraterrestrial life at the bottom of Dongting Lake. And there have been dozens of UAP sightings over Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and others, and the list goes on and on. So apparently, people think that lakes are very attractive to extraterrestrial life. I might add, though, that there are some reports that extraterrestrials are actually afraid of water and that water can destroy them. And you can look that up on the internet. You can look up almost anything on the internet, right? So, in conclusion, that's a big tour of things like mummies and ghosts and witches and spooky stuff about lakes. In conclusion, the lakes are the most mysterious, spookiest, and most supernatural places on Earth. Well, they preserve the undead and mummies in two kinds of diverse sorts of ways. Lakes preserve all kinds of stuff like trees, wicked party boats, mastodons, other kinds of material. And lakes are famous for having ghosts, witches, and monsters. And we may have driven wicked water fairies and lake monsters toward extinction. And I'm somewhat concerned about that because if they figured it out, they may be rather unhappy about it. Aliens and extraterrestrials, however, may be taking their places in our water bodies. So, in grand conclusion, I'd say be careful on the lakes, and I wish you all a really happy Halloween. It's so fun to be able to mix a little lake science with a little spookiness for this fun holiday. Thanks very much. And finally, if you know of reported lake monsters, ghosts, or witches near you, or if you've seen Will-o'-the-Wisp, please get in touch with me. I'd really like to hear what you have seen, what you've observed, and where it's happened. These have been reported everywhere. My email is down at the bottom, downing@umn.edu, and my phone number's there. You can leave voicemail. So thank you so very much for your attention. And I guess if there are any questions, I'd be delighted to take them.
Thank you, Dr. Downing. That was pretty cool. Now, let's go to the Q&A portion of today's program. It will be hosted by Bill Granchis. Bill is the director of the Itasca County AIS program, excuse me, and a longtime board member with Itasca Waters. Bill?
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone. Happy Halloween, and welcome to today's question and answer session. Submit your questions using the Q&A function. Don't use the chat. We're not using chat. Now, I'm going to read the questions aloud. We may mix and combine similar questions together. I'll read the questions, and Dr. Downing will then give the answers. If we don't get to your question, please feel free to email us, and we'll get you an answer back as soon as we can. Okay, let's start the Q&A. And our first question for you, John, is what happens to those preserved bodies when you take them out of the water?
Yeah, Well, they break down really fast, Bill. And in fact, the Dean Mabel Douglas, when they removed her body from the water, at first they thought it was a recent murder, and they called in the veterinarian who was actually the coroner in that area, and he had to rush to run an autopsy because the body was coming apart really fast. He did, however, report that at first, when the body was brought up, actually organs were all in really excellent condition, but they decomposed super quickly after that. And I don't know really the mechanism of that, probably bacterial decomposition that had been slowed down by cool waters and low oxygen. And just maybe mechanical movement. It's the bodies are a little bit tender when they've been saponified like that. So they do tend to go away pretty quickly. And they're hard to, I looked for pictures of them. I found very few. Mostly you can find them, if they're underwater photos, you'll see those because they do decompose quickly.
Fascinating. I just want to take a moment here and say thank you to Marty, Leah, and Beth Ann. A lot of people are starting to say in here, thank you and happy Halloween. Anyway, next question. Oh, good one. Have people found bog bodies in Minnesota?
They must have. I can't imagine with the amount of bog we've got and the amount of peat harvesting that goes on, it's almost unimaginable that some sort of life hasn't been unearthed. But I could not find any reports in the northern part of Minnesota of these mummified bog bodies. There are a lot of them in Europe, but then again, population density was higher in Europe for a longer period of time, and just maybe there weren't that many people tossed into bogs. Just looking at the number of acid and brown water lakes that we see, particularly in the northern part of the state, there just have to be there has to be some kind of mummification of some sort of life, but I could not find any, and I looked pretty hard.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody who knows of any, please let me know. I'd be delighted to hear about it. There's interesting science, and that's the science is what gets me into it. But also it is really creepy and strange. And it actually can teach us a whole bunch about what went on in the past, because people and animals and so on are very, very well preserved if they're in those conditions.
Well, Dr. Downing, you're a diver, aren't you? Haven't you come across any bog bodies or lake bodies in your diving career?
Yeah, I find them mostly, in my younger days, I did some cadaver recovery and so they weren't very recently they were pretty recently dead, but that is also extremely creepy, especially in lakes where you don't have much visibility. You're groping around looking for something you don't really want to find. But no, I have found, okay, so I have seen entire schools of fish saponified on the bottom. I mean, in lakes that have had some sort of winter kill, you'll often find the fish pretty well preserved, lying on the top of the sediment, and there'll be hundreds of them. I've seen them in a couple of lakes.
Okay. Anne has actually two questions for us. I like your sense of humor, by the way, Anne. Why doesn't Lake Erie have any monster sightings? It's Erie.
Oh, they do. No, Erie does have. I just didn't talk about Lake Erie. And I'm trying to remember the name of it. Maybe Anne really knows. It's something that sounds like Pressy, because I think the Lake Superior monster was named after the Lake Erie monster. Is it Bessie? Something similar to that. And I don't know if anyone knows, they could put it in the Q&A. Yes, Lake Erie does. Practically I think every Great Lake has had a reported monster of some kind.
Okay, and then Anne follows up with, slightly more seriously, Is there any correlation between lake monster sightings and lake temperature and surrounding forest cover?
I don't know, but just looking at the data on that map that I showed, it seems like cooler regions have more monster sightings, or reported monster sightings. Wisconsin is I don't know why so many monsters have been reported from Wisconsin. Maybe people have more vivid imaginations. But looking at the northern part of Wisconsin, there aren't a whole lot of big lakes. And most monster sightings are in largish lakes. But really, I mean, to be totally serious, unless they're herbivores and small, they may be something else.
Okay, next question. Oh, by the way, Karen, I'm not wearing a costume. This is natural. Thank you, Karen. Okay, anyway, next question. Because things don't break down fast in lake sediments, does that mean the whole history of a lake is down there?
Absolutely. In fact, I cut out that slide, but the fact that things are that materials are preserved for long periods of time has been used by a whole area called paleolimnology, where they'll take a core out of the lake and they can reconstruct the history of that lake in pretty substantial detail. And they use it. They do it using subfossils, various kinds of fossilized material, but also things like fish scales and so on. And they'll use algae, particular algae called diatoms that are super well preserved in sediments. So yes, probably the whole history is down there. And it is used by science to figure out things like, for example, when did the Anthropocene start? And that was basically based on core sampling. And they're terrific people in Minnesota, scientists who are studying the history of various lakes in lots of different ways. And now they're using also environmental DNA to figure out what kinds of organisms lived in lakes at different times throughout their history. So yeah, thanks for asking.
Okay, next question. What are your thoughts and stories surrounding bull sharks in the Great Lakes?
Well, here's a problem. Scientists can tell you who it is, but they can't tell you what isn't. That is, there's this whole field called cryptozoology that studies things that you can't observe, living organisms, well, purportedly living organisms you can't observe. And so as a scientist, or, you can't say they don't exist, right? I mean, because you'd have to, in fact, drain the Great Lakes and look for every possible bull shark place, so we can't say they don't exist. So I think it's okay to keep an open mind. Sharks can survive. Some species of sharks can survive in fresh water pretty well. I think it's kind of unlikely. But then again, lots of animals that we thought didn't exist were later found to exist. Take the coelacanth, for example, this fossil fish that people thought had been extinct for 1 million years. Well, they're swimming around in the ocean. Then we just had to look harder to find them. And another kind of problem is that probably only 5% of all the species that live in lakes on the planet have been actually looked at and identified. So we know less than 5% of those things that live in lakes, and there are probably 250,000 species in these lakes. So can we say that bull sharks don't exist in Great Lakes? No, impossible to say that scientifically. Is it likely? That we can say something about, and it's pretty unlikely.
Okay, thank you, John. Next question from Karen. A hunter disappeared near Jacobson near a bog quite a number of years ago. Many searches were conducted. What are the chances the body is in a bottomless bog?
Well, let's start with the bottomless part. And probably not bottomless, but they're seemingly bottomless because it's very mucky organic sediment down there. If a person falls into a bog and they are acid enough and have enough organic matter, or that brownness, tea stain or coffee stain to the water, rapidly that tissue can be mummified by that lake and perhaps found later. There are some horrible stories that people tell me not to. Public Radio International told me I shouldn't tell the story, but they're really, really sad stories of people who ran away from home and were found 40, 50 years later by their own families, mummified in bogs. There's some in Indiana and Illinois, some stories like that. So I can't say about that specific case, but if a living thing falls into a bog, particularly a human being that doesn't have kind of a lot of hair and stuff on it, they can be essentially tanned, dehydrated, and preserved for long periods of time. It certainly can happen.
Okay.
And I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to hear about the disappearance of the hunter. That's sad.
Okay. From Jim, have you heard of Lake Wendigo, a lake in Star Island in Cass Lake County? Cass Lake, sorry.
I believe I've heard. I mean, I have a list of all the lakes in Minnesota, and I've looked at them pretty carefully. But tell me, Jim, what is it about Lake Wendigo that you're wondering about? I'd love to hear more. Can you put something in the Q&A?
I'll watch for it.
Okay. And I'd like to say that if you have information on ghost sightings and monster sightings in various Minnesota lakes, particularly, I'd love to hear about them. And I'm just open-minded enough to not be terribly skeptical. So I take it with good humor.
Very good. Okay, Caitlin, this is not a question, but she says, if you happen to be on TikTok, there is a content creator that does Spooky Lake Month, where they focus on interesting and haunted bodies of water around the world during the month of October. Apparently, they're coming out with a book in October you might be interested in. Thank you for that, Caitlin.
Oh, that would be really fun. I have not been doing TikTok, but yeah, I'd love to have a link. Yeah.
Jim's gotten back to us. He says a Wendigo is a mythical Ojibwe creature.
Oh yeah, right. That is very murderous and can't be escaped, I think. And that I guess would be a different kind of terrestrial monster. I didn't get too much in. I think they are not aquatic, or supposed perhaps not aquatic. As a kid, I heard about Wendigo, the Wendigo, and also campfire stories and so on. But usually it was going to creep up behind you and murder you. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and a lake named after that. Yeah, I didn't pick that one up. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
Oh, there's Wendigo arm on Pekegama. I guess if Bigfoot went swimming, that would be an aquatic monster. But well, anyway, I digress. Why do you think so many people think lakes are haunted with ghosts?
I think first off, as I said early on, they're mysterious because you don't really know what's in them. Another reason would be, unfortunately, people drown in lakes and disappear in lakes, and their bodies are often not recovered. And I think there are aspects to lakes, especially when a lake is relatively warm compared to the air. There will be, my dad used to show me ghost ships out on the lake. He'd say they're ghost ships tonight, and these would be ghostly bits of sort of steam and low cloud that would float across the surface of the water, and so they look really spooky. And in in a full moon or a bright sky, it's pretty easy to let the imagination run wild. And maybe not run wild. You see these things and they look like something, and it's perfectly legitimate observation. I think maybe though that combination of factors might make ghosts very common, observations around lakes.
Very good. Next question. Is it possible that we just don't see the will-o'-the-wisp because of light pollution?
Yeah, it's possible, but I think, even looking, there are a lot of really dark places, and I saw will-o'-the-wisp when I was a kid, in Itasca County. My dad pointed it out to me, and I've never seen it in that locale ever again. And I don't think there's a lot more light in my area. We see the lights of Grand Rapids a little over on the horizon. So I don't think that's the explanation. And I have actually counted the number of news stories on will-o'-the-wisp over the last century and a half in the New York Times, and made a graph of it, and they have just dropped down to almost nothing. And I would be delighted if anyone has observed will-o'-the-wisp or the so-called jack-o'-lantern in the out in the, over a pond or a lake. Please let me know. I'm really interested in the chemistry of that. Phosphorus, is real important for a variety of things in lakes. And the idea of gaseous forms, phosphine, for example, floating up out of water is really intriguing. So please let me know if you've seen it. I think it's not just light pollution. That may be a factor.
Okay. Thank you, John. Madison asks, have you heard of Grindstone Lake in Sandstone, Minnesota? Apparently it has caverns and is mysteriously connected to Lake Superior.
I've heard of Grindstone Lake, and that I thought it was a reservoir on the Grindstone River. I didn't know there were caverns. The geology seems kind of, usually you get caverns in limestone and so on, and I don't know that that's what's there. I'd love to hear more about that. Connection to Lake Superior. Well, actually one of the first books I used to read as a kid was called McGilligut's Pool, which isn't actually produced anymore because it was inappropriate in some ways, but it was all about fish coming in from the ocean, and there are lots of reports of bottomless lakes or lakes that are so deep that they're connected elsewhere. But usually you see those because people sound the lake with a piece of hemp rope with a heavy weight on it, and by the time you put out a lot of rope, the rope itself is so heavy that it makes the lake look bottomless. I'd love to hear more about the caverns, and if anyone's observed them. And the chemistry of Grindstone Lake would be really different, I think, from that of Lake Superior, and you'd think that they might mix if they're connected at least strongly. In the end, all lakes are connected to the groundwater in some way, and in fact, my geologist friends say lakes are just an outcropping of the groundwater. So, it's not impossible, certainly, but tell me more. I'd love to know more.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madison, for that. Sarah would like to know, this is a good one. Are there any known haunted ferry boats or other public transportation?
Haunted ferry boat? Oh, ferry, F-E-R-R-Y. Yeah, ferry.
Oh,
not. I got it. Okay, I was working on it. Yes, on Lake George, New York, there are reports of hauntings on some of the boats. Oftentimes, if the boats are old, they end up on the bottom, or scuttled. I think some of the river boats on the Mississippi had reported hauntings, but I don't know a whole lot about that. But my guess is if there is, since 18% of the people in the United States believe they've seen a ghost, they've pretty much seen them everywhere. So yes, probably.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one last question here. If there are monsters in Minnesota lakes, what lakes might be most likely to have them?
Yeah, it'd be the really big lakes would be the most likely to have them. And by most likely, I mean it's kind of a vanishing likelihood, but it would be the really big ones, Lake of the Woods, the Basswood chain, and Cabotogama, Leech. Red Lake, the two Red Lakes are not terribly deep, so there's not much place to hide. Leech Lake would be a possibility. And of course, we've already covered things like, the Lake Pepin potential monster and so on. So the bigger lakes, lakes where there's a lot of vegetation to eat, because they got to be herbivores. They simply can't be carnivores. So don't be afraid. I think just basically the bigger lakes.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Downing. Brian, I'm going to turn this back over to you now.
All right. Thank you, John, and thank you, Bill. It's a really excellent program and fascinating. I think we could go for another hour. So if you would like to watch the program again or recommend it to your friends and neighbors, a recording of today's talk will soon be on our website at itascawaters.org. We would love to get your feedback, so click on the survey link, which will be on screen at the end of today's program, should be there now, or you'll be getting an email evaluation form from Itasca Waters, so you can choose how you'd like to respond. We would really appreciate hearing from you. Our next program, and our final one for the year, will be on November 2nd, and our speaker will be Dr. Leslie Knoll. She will be speaking about ice formation and melting on lakes, what we know and why it matters. I'm Brian Whittemore. Thanks for being with us today.